Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hannock here, along with co-host Matthew Bartko, Mario Ramos-Ureyes, Christy Yao, John Breen, and a special guest, Vasil Chetkowski. We begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. This week, with Christy Yao in the lead, we'll take a look at the Socialist Party of America. And I'm going to ask Christy to begin by introducing our special guest, who is a member of the Socialist Party of America. Christy?
All right. Well, I hope everyone gives a warm welcome to Vasil, the press secretary, am I getting that right, of the Socialist Party of America, and PhD candidate at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So, exciting.
I'm like Christy's friend.
Hey, he sounds like a running rebel. He sounds like a running rebel.
All right, so let's start off by just telling us a little bit about the Socialist Party of America. I think everyone gets a little bit confused between Democratic Socialist Party of America, Socialist Party of the USA. I know I get confused all the time, so just give us a little run.
Be sure you're unmuted.
Gladly, thank you guys for having me on your show. So the SPA is an education organization. It is derivative of the Democracy at Work movement, which was started by Dr. Richard Wolff. So I have to begin by talking about that for a little bit. The Democracy at Work movement is a form of socialism that's very critical of socialism in the 20th century. But it accepts the analysis of capitalism that the socialists brought to the table. That is the alienation of your labor when you're in the workforce, the fact that one class owns production, owns profit, owns generational wealth, and hands out wages to other people, and those people collect the wages, and most of that goes to their cost of living, and they have no ability to move up under that system without organizing within the workplace and calling for concessions. But it all comes down to how do we fix that situation, and the socialism in the 20th century was focused on bringing the other people down to the level of the workers in order to empower the workers. And while they accomplished a lot in terms of providing healthcare, in terms of spurring global progressive reforms, they never changed the relationship in the workplace. The worker felt that they used to belong to the capitalist, and now they belong to the state. And that is why there was a lot of discontent under that socialism. There was still discontent about capitalism, but they knew that that was not the correct answer on how to proceed after capitalism. The Democracy at Work movement calls for the empowerment of workers instead of bringing anybody else down. We call for direct control of more land, more production, and more profit to the working class, and the best way to do that is through an economy of worker-owned cooperatives. And that is what the program of the SPA, and that is what the program of the Democracy at Work movement supports. Now, what do we add to the table as an education organization? Well, the founder of Democracy at Work has not been able to answer a few questions that we think are key. How is that program going to be put into practice? What would be the consequence of that program? So there needs to be some kind of political organization, some kind of education organization that puts that together. He has his own focus on building up the cooperatives, which is wonderful, and we support it. But we have our own focus on spreading that message to people. And we feel like these two components will eventually keep growing. They're already growing faster than any of the other parties because they have an actual theory behind them and not just 30 different views of everything getting thrown into the kitchen sink that they think is socialist. So we're growing steadily in that direction under a common program, the Democracy at Work program, that we feel like all Americans can get behind, whether they're centrist, liberal, conservative, or whatever. But that will become a base for revolutionary changes later on. The working class, just like any other class in the country, wants to control the product of their own labor. They want to be socially mobile. They want economic freedom. And they will eventually start organizing for those objectives. And we want to be there to help them do that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So our next question is something I've kind of grown to know. Growing up in a fairly conservative suburban Maryland community, I always thought socialism was a bad word. It was taboo. You don't even talk about it. It's so bad. It's people coming in and stealing your cows and everything's awful and it would go back to the dark ages. But I've always been a rebel. And as I got older, I started to think, hey, maybe this thing of distributing goods and distributing opportunities isn't such a bad thing. So if you could just give us a little overview of what socialism is, that'd be great.
Well, it's quite simple. It's an economic system based on social ownership. How does the idea for that come about? It didn't exist for a long time in our history, but now it exists. Why is that? It exists because capitalism came. And what happened under capitalism was stuff that was individually owned remained individually owned. It's still owned by individuals. But production became social. It used to be you produce something as an individual, you sell it as an individual, and you keep that money as an individual. Everything today, almost everything, 99.9% of GDP, is produced socially. So the idea is if things are produced by multiple people, why not have multiple people be the owners of that? And that's what produced the idea of socialism. That idea cannot go away because it's a fair way of doing things and having a bunch of people produce things and a few people owning those things and owning the product of those people's labor. So we see history as a sort of a struggle between classes where one class wants to extract value from the labor of the lower class. And that's where the workers are in. That's the same position that the business owners were in under the aristocracy and the monarchy. The workers in a position where they produce things, they come up with ideas, and they don't own any of that. And we want to give them the power to own the means of production so they own the product of their own labor.
Thank you very much again. Christy, I wonder if we should ask for questions, having had a definition of what counts as socialism and at least a quick introduction to what the Socialist Party of America is and its relationship to the democracy work movement.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to open it up to the other panelists.
I'd like to ask a question or two, if I may. Does the Socialist Party, which you are representing, are they in favor or not in favor of a free market society?
That's a good question. One of the mistakes that socialists in the 20th century made was buying into this idea of the capitalist market as being an integral part of the overturning of the capitalist mode of production. So markets have been around since before capitalism, well into feudalism. The way we view it is this. There was a struggle for security in the first place between slaves and masters. And that produced things called fiefdoms. So that was the first struggle that we fought, was a struggle for feudalism, a struggle for personal security. The second struggle that we fought was a struggle for capitalism that took place as a struggle for political freedom. And the third fight that we're going to have, and we are fighting right now, is a fight for economic freedom. And that is how we view socialism. We don't try to conjecture what kind of socialist society is going to come out after workers decide that they want to run production themselves. There's going to be parts of that are planned. And some parts of that are going to operate on a market basis. Even in the height of the Stalinist period in Russia, you still had 10% of the economy operate on a market basis. Now, are markets inherently good? No, there's no such thing as a free market. Every market has always been regulated. because the person who gains advantages on day one tries to secure those advantages on day two and up. And they don't produce, so they're part of the problem that doesn't produce a lot of social mobility. But looking at it as a spectrum, we can't get rid of markets. It's about the people deciding for themselves how they want the economy to function. Do they want parts of the economy to be provided socially, or do they want parts of the economy to be operating on a market basis? And so you will have a mixture of those two. You've always had. No country has been able to 100% get rid of markets. When it comes to sellers markets, I mean, obviously we're against those. I mean, I can sell you an ambulance ride for $3,500 just because you need it. Is that a good thing? No, it's terrible. But as far as farmers markets and things like that, those are not going away. They never have. So you will see a mixture of both, and it will vary by degree. Something that we learned from the 20th century is every socialism builds, every society that builds its own socialism does it in its own way. In Yugoslavia, where I'm from, you had plenty of markets. In the Soviet Union, you had less. So, but our main focus is on building it through democracy in the workplace from the bottom up, and then letting the people decide how they want those sectors of the economy to function.
Well, the same could be said about a free market. I mean, if you apply the laws of supply and demand, if there's a different demand, then the supply is going to change. So, what was that?
If I may clarify, are we talking about the difference between how goods are produced then brought to market, as opposed to viewing the market as all-encompassing?
I'm just talking about a free market society where basically the room is open for competition, and where the buyers can ultimately decide, or the consumers rather, however you want to phrase it, is that they can determine the fate of a country's economy.
The consumers do not determine the fate of a country's economy under just having a market system. That doesn't happen. Otherwise, why would the consumers agree to pay 30 years, every single month, thousands of dollars for something that's bricks and nails put together by people making $20 an hour called a house that they need, right? You pay for these things because you need them. That gives you an advantage to the producer, not to the consumer. There's no such thing as a market where the consumers are in control. That hasn't happened. We've heard a lot of propaganda about that. I've spoken for a very long time, but that's not what happens. Specifically, again, we want the people to decide how they want their economy to function. If they want to keep markets, that's perfectly fine. In whatever sector they want to keep markets. But what we do not want is labor to function as a market. This is the point. As a worker, you are a commodity in the market system itself. We're trying to remove you by making you an owner. And so you're not a commodity. What is the price of labor? The market price of labor is the minimum amount to keep labor coming back to work, and not anything after that. Everything else they had to fight for. Education they had to fight for. Healthcare they had to fight for. The market price of labor is the minimum amount to keep you doing the same thing over and over again at your job. So our focus is on getting rid of markets from the labor perspective, to decommodify labor. And then after that, as far as the economy goes, those laborers themselves will be able to figure out how they want their economy structured.
Okay. Like we can go on economy, but I'd like to ask another question. When it comes to socialism as under definition, at what point do you balance individual rights with collective rights? Which one trumps the other, according to the socialist ideology?
Define those for me.
So individual rights, meaning that me as an individual, that I have certain individual rights that no one can really coerce upon me for the sake of the collective population. So if it comes to a choice between the rights of the masses or individual rights, where does the Socialist Party side on?
Okay, it's very simple. Again, we had 3 fights in our history. First fight for security, second fight for political freedom, third fight is going to be for economic freedom. Your individual rights, whatever you do as an individual, cannot take away from the security of other people, from the political freedom of other people, and from the economic freedom of other people, which is exactly what our system does. You can call it the most clandestine type of democracy, but at the end of the day, everybody who's a representative, or almost everybody, is a member of the capitalist class. Every single worker organization in America spends about $100 million per election cycle, which is something that a billionaire can pull out of his pocket, write a check, and that's like a mosquito bit him. So there is no such thing as full political freedom and economic freedom under our current system, where wealth is generational. You will have all the individual rights. We're expanding the individual rights of the individual, which is what socialists have always talked about. When Marx praised the Paris Commune, it was because it provided more individual rights and had no hierarchy. Proudhon and all the other people who saw socialism only through a perspective of individual rights supported individual rights. But you can't have full individual freedom and full individual economic opportunity and political freedom unless the means of production are socially owned by a collective body, which you would be a part of because you're helping produce things too, but they have to be done through a collective party and through collective decision making.
So when it boils down to whether it's collective rights or individual rights, then the rights of everyone else trumps individual rights then?
It might be helpful if you proposed a specific scenario for our guest to address.
Okay, like gun control. Do you or do you not have the right to protect yourself?
Socialists in America are generally in favor of decreasing gun control that I've seen. There's a Socialist Rifle Association. Some socialist countries had restricted gun rights or at some point of their history, and they expanded them at other points of their history. Albania, for example, had guns for almost every person, and many socialist countries actually expanded the right to bear arms. Now, this is a social issue. So much like other social issues, it needs to be decided through a community organization. It needs to be decided democratically. I can't tell you whether or not you have something that was given to you, by the way, by the government. The government provided the right to bear arms in this country, and they restricted it throughout history. When the United States was formed, you had to be a member of a militia and swear an oath to the government to have the right to bear an arm. Many people don't know that today. It was D.C. v. Heller, a Supreme Court case in 2008, that actually expanded the right to bear arms to individuals in their own property and secured that right that we have today. So that is a community decision. It's not something that I can answer specifically.
It's a community decision based off of individual rights, that they recognize that you, as an individual, does have the right to protect themselves, and the collective, the group of people who upheld that made the decision based off of the individual right.
I think we're getting a little bit onto tangents with specific issues now, so if we could kind of move along.
How about if we have Mario have a say here? I see his circle glowing.
No. I'm listening with great interest the conversation. I have a question though, and I'm very curious about something that you said about socialism. You said all socialism. I'm not exactly that's your words, but you said, well, many socialist movement or many socialism system make a mistake. Now, when I look at history, there has been a different system called socialist, but in themselves they're quite different. It's not the same Lenin socialism or Stalin socialism or the Social Democrats. If you go to Spain right now, the prime minister is a socialist. But they are quite different in the way that they address the ownership of the means of production. What really you mean by socialism in the case of the movement to which you belong.
Okay, so I'll give a few more words on what I mean by the mistakes of the 20th century. They put everything on the national level of analysis. This was the problem. So if capitalism was about
let me okay, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but what do you mean by that? Be more specific. I mean,
yes, so socialism in the
right.
20th century became about producing what is socially necessary. So it's socially ownership of production, producing what is socially necessary. And capitalism is individual ownership of production, producing what is individually necessary. And that is where you see these other socialists that call for state control to tell people what to produce and things like that. It is derivative of that.
Right.
The democracy at work movement puts things on an individual level of analysis, on the level of the enterprise. What did socialism promise that made it so appealing in the 19th century? It was the idea that you would not be alienated from your labor any longer. It was the idea of owning the product of your own labor that enamored people towards socialism. So we mean the ability to control production, which in property terms, and this is probably what you're asking, translates to this: family ownership and individual ownership without hired labor, cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, and public property that's owned by producers and consumers through a joint committee where they're both elected. So I can give more and more details because we have only so much time, but those are the three forms of property that we recognize under the democracy at work movement to have in a socialist society.
Okay, thank you. Christy, you wanted to move forward?
Of course, yeah. So, obviously, a American Solidarity Party show. How do you see the Socialist Party of America as similar to the American Solidarity Party? And how can we cooperate with each other and kind of work toward the common goal?
Okay, good question. First of all, politics is three-dimensional. So there's the foreign policy dimension, economics, and social issues. On two of those dimensions, we inherently, I think, agree on, and that's economics and foreign policy. As ironic as it is, and I know a lot of people in the ASP, I'm not going to mention names of who I know in the ASP, to plenty of people, realize that economically we're fully aligned. Our program is the same economic program as the ASP that calls for worker-owned co-ops. On foreign policy, we can certainly cooperate. I don't think that anybody in your country supports imperialism and aggression and things like that. So those are two giant areas that make up the political spectrum where we're pretty much fully aligned. The only thing stopping cooperation is this idea that socialism is an icky word, which is, Mario, I think, points out that there are socialists that you may disagree with, that we disagree with, but the Democracy at Work movement is a broad, common program that gets people together. And most people do agree that there is an alternative to capitalism. So let's search for it together. Now, how would we make a difference? That is the question, I think, the broader question that you're getting at. First of all, people have this mindset in America that third parties don't make a difference. It's absolutely false. The entire programs and the concessions that were given by Republicans and Democrats comes from how third parties and third party movements are organized. When movements go in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, they go there to die. When movements start organizing outside of those two parties, they actually get concessions. How do we get the progressive era? By having socialists organize the unions, the protests, the strikes, and all the stuff that wasn't even legal at the time that they were doing, is what spurred the progressive reforms and got rich people to agree to pay 90% taxes. Now, it's not directly what we're calling for, but the point is that when you organize in a third party, and when third parties get together in third party organizations, they get things. Because it sends a message to the system that, wait a minute, these people do exist who think like that, and they're growing. That means that our own base is going to eventually might think about following them. So let's give something to the people. And the reason that the workers haven't gotten anything in the last 50 years is because they're not organizing outside of the Democratic and Republican Party. So we need to get together and we need to talk about why those two parties are so corrupt and stick to an anti-corruption message. Almost every two-party system has been broken, and it's broken every single time by multiple organizations outside of the two parties sticking to an anti-corruption message. So that's the first area that we need to cooperate. And the second area we need to cooperate is by calling for something that people can recognize. And I think that should be democracy at work. It's something that people can intuitively recognize. Wouldn't you like to have democracy at the work? Sure, why not? And by calling for that, you get things from the system. You already see that. And by the way, it comes from both parties. It's Republicans and Democrats who are now running candidates that support worker-owned cooperatives, not just the Democrats. So we will get things from the system if we work together. If we don't work together, if we work through the Democratic and Republican Party, we will get absolutely nothing. That needs to be the unified message that we send out there.
I'd like to ask, what counts as corruption on your view?
Well, there's so many examples I could say. One of the recent examples is something that has happened in the banking sector since the bailout. Okay? I think people recognize the term corruption. They know that the system is corrupt, but they don't actually know in what ways it's becoming more and more corrupt. So here's an example that I can give. We know that the banks were bailed out in 2008, right? But what has happened since then is something different. They've gotten themselves to form a policy called a bail-in, is what we're socialists have been calling it, what Dr. Wolf calls it. So essentially, what the banks would do is they would take people's money and they would gamble it, and when their gambles didn't pay off, they would go to the government and ask for that money back. But because they don't want to be seen as doing that now, they're going toward the people and asking them for that money. They're upping their fees and things like that. Can you do that? Can you take money from the people to fund your own investments as a bank? In many countries, it's illegal. And here, it is absolutely legal. I mean, our friend here talks about the market system where you get to determine, the consumers determine how things are run. But did you know that if you work for one minimum wage company, you cannot go work for another minimum wage company? That you cannot negotiate wages with them? Absolutely. There's a law that says a minimum wage company or any company that produces minimum wage, they have agreements that they cannot poach other workers. So if you work and you make $10 an hour, $8.25 or whatever, and you put in your time and you put in your dues and you exceed expectations in any way possible, another company cannot offer you a better wage because they have an agreement where you cannot offer my employees a better wage. That's absolute corruption. And that's not even getting into what we call lobbying, which is called bribery in other parts of the world. I mean, what is more... I think I just made a statement. All the working class organizations spend $100 million per election cycle. And the billionaire can pull a paycheck out and it's like a mosquito bit him. So the system cannot, under those circumstances, benefit the people. Another form of corruption, and this has happened recently as well, is what has happened since the fall of the USSR and the fall of the progressive movement in America, which couldn't exist after there was no threat of socialism, there's no need for a progressive movement, is that social policies used to fund social provided companies. So when the government would build something, they would build it on their own land. When the government would fund something like a hospital, it would be a nonprofit hospital. But now, even when the government provides a service, that service comes from a private company. And this is something that people have not recognized yet. So if you're on food stamps, they call that social welfare, and people say that's a handout, it's bad, it teaches people that they shouldn't have to work for what they get. Food stamps are a handout to a private company, they're a handout to Walmart. Every part of our policy has been every every part of our government programs has been privatized, including the ones that provide social welfare. Social welfare today is a handout to capitalists. So it's to the point where even if you tax people 70%, the way the progressives did from the 30s and the 60s, you can only give that money back to them. You can only give that money back to wealthy people. There's nothing that the government can do because the government doesn't have access to anything. All they can do is fund private companies to provide services to workers. And people have not recognized how out of control things have gotten. They don't think about where does the money from the government go. All of it goes to the capitalist. That's how you get a division of where 0.01% owns everything. No matter what you tax them, all of the money goes back to them. That's pure corruption. Our system is by definition corruption. So when we talk about corruption, we find it synonymous with the word capitalism, quite frankly.
That seemed to be what you were suggesting earlier, and it's nice to have it made explicit. I'm curious, to what extent are you familiar with distributism?
I think you mean market socialism.
Well, actually, distributism is a historical movement. There are various figures associated with it. It has to do certainly with worker ownership, extends beyond worker ownership, the idea of the greatest distribution of goods and resources possible. And historically, distributists have been very strongly in favor of worker-owned co-ops. One of the things they've been leery about are governments that purport to be socialist, but in fact what we have is the state ownership of the means of production and the means of communication rather than worker ownership and worker control. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you're familiar with distributism. For example, if you go back to the 1800s, William Cobbett in England was a contemporary of Marx, but had a very different view of the role of the worker in relationship to the state. Or if you look to G.K. Chesterton in the last century, Chesterton began as a socialist, but wanted to argue that in fact socialism led to state ownership, and state ownership wasn't much better, probably was, because it might be a bit more organized, worse than capital ownership. And he labored and worked and lobbied and wrote in favor of something called distributism. And then if you look later, you have somebody like E.F. Schumacher, quite a well-known figure. And I think to the extent that the American Solidarity Party is simpatico with worker ownership, it probably comes more from its sense of the distributist heritage than it does from the socialist background, if only because socialism has such a checkered history and has taken so many different forms.
I think what Basil's trying to say, Jim, is that distributism is what many refer to as market socialism. It's a form of socialism.
Well, I don't know whether it would be wise to identify it in terms of market. All sorts of things are market-oriented. The focus on distributism is really on who's owning and who's directing. But let me dig a little bit deeper. I think one thing we're all agreed on is that there's something wrong with the commodification of labor, that the commodification of labor is really a form of violence against the dignity of the person. But what we might wonder about is, to what do socialists attribute the dignity of the person? I'm not sure. In the American Solidarity Party, I would think that the great majority of the members would ground the dignity of the person on what's sometimes called imago Dei, that each person is ultimately made in the image and likeness of God. Now, when you have that view, you're less likely to use the rhetoric of class versus class, and you're more likely to speak in terms of human dignity. Oftentimes, when I look to not early 1900s progressives, but contemporary progressives, oftentimes I don't see what they base the dignity of the person on. And I think one of the things we need to do as we look for ways of cooperating is to address specific issues like worker ownership, which we're very sympathetic to, with foundational issues like what is the basis of the dignity of the human person? I think contemporary political liberalism is absolutely bankrupt when it comes to that question. It's a question that it refuses to answer. At any rate, Vassilios, at any point you want to jump in on that, feel free.
Would you correct me if I'm wrong? This is Matthew speaking.
I know that voice. I know that dulcet voice.
Is it correct to say that the majority of the current socialist movement spends a majority of its passion on economic issues as opposed to social issues, and is happy to put those other two political camps of social issues and foreign policy issues up to the democratic will of whatever the collective of workers is? You know, they have very definite economic policy, but not necessarily unity on social or foreign policy issues. Or is that a misunderstanding on my part?
Well, now backing up a little bit, I was pleased with the idea that on foreign policy we'd have significant agreement with socialists. Socialists like Randolph Bourne, for example, in the context of World War I, famously said, "War is the health of the state." But even there, oftentimes it seemed to me in socialist history, the idea was workers should not be involved in military conflicts against workers. Whereas I would like to argue that the dignity of the human person is such that there ought not to be violence or organized violence against anyone, worker, capitalist, king, serf, anyone whatsoever. But that again takes us back to something deeper than class affiliation. I think that's important. At any rate, what does the guest have to say?
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head on class affiliation. We didn't come up with the classes, however. Our analysis is based on the classes, which means that we cannot talk about the dignity of the individual and ignore the fact that classes exist. But our whole analysis is based on how do we come to this point, and how do we move forward to eliminate classes so that we can have the true dignity of the individual. So I don't think there's any disagreement with us on that point. How did our classes come up? Okay. In the first place, people made agreements with other people in the countryside that they wouldn't enslave them because they had a bunch of slaves in the cities. The slaves got old. They had to produce new slaves. And so what happened? The people in the countryside formed fiefdoms. We got feudalism. Then what happened? The bourgeoisie were the individual owners of production. They were the ones contributing most to society and not getting a whole lot out of it. They were promised local government. They were promised a seat in parliament. They were promised investment in their machinery. And then at the end of the day, the monarchs and the aristocracy said, "Hey, we're in debt. We have to tax you. Sorry, we don't care if you disagree." And that produced capitalism. They rose up. So for any true dignity to happen, the workers themselves are in a position where they firstly have to rise up. That's our whole analysis of history. Now, Marx didn't invent socialism. Socialism was a word that was before them. The idea of communism is a word before them. The hunters and gatherers were by definition needs-based societies. He didn't come up with these terms, and he's not the father of them. What he did is he provided a method of analysis for how they can exist and become valid movements. So that is what we bring to the table, and that is what we bring to the distributist movement as well, which we are in full agreement on. What you just said and the people that you quoted, they don't have anything. They sound strangely similar to Proudhon, or if you look at why Stalin broke with Tito and tried to kill him, it's because Tito was by supported forms of distributism. So, but we expand the definition somewhat. So there's three forms of property that we accept. One of those is the worker-owned co-op. The others is family ownership that doesn't use hired labor, and the other one is public ownership that consists of representatives from consumers and producers. And so people should have the right to choose if they would like representatives to control how the distribution of things like houses comes. That's one of the major ones, because even if it were run by a cooperative, you still need a house and they can sell it to you for whatever price they want. But if you had a situation where the producers make it and they negotiate with the consumers how much they would like to get paid for that, and there's no profit on the top, there's simply the wage, well, I mean, the producers can make more than they make now. People who build houses make $20-25 an hour. They can make $50 an hour and still sell it, and it would be not the price it is now. So, to answer your question, what we see the dignity of the person. The dignity is an economy that takes care of one another. An economy, the end goal of all socialism, the end goal of workers' ownership. What it would do is other things that put us on a path to true human kindness and dignity. And I don't mean that in an abstract way. I mean something very serious that we summarize in the phrase, from each according to his needs. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. What do you get under a socialist economy? You get the incentive to automate. Automation frees people from the labor that they have to do, whereas right now automation is terrible under capitalism. It produces unemployment and homeless people.
Let me interject just one more time, and then I see that John Breen is looking out at us too with his mic on, not off. This is a matter of broad historical and philosophical analysis, but there's widespread agreement that there was a strong element of humanism in the early Marx. In the later Marx, that element of humanism was submerged. And when you read, say, John Paul II's encyclical Laborem Exercens, one of the things he says is that in a kind of peculiar way, both capitalism and communism agreed that the central foundation for understanding the human person is the economy. And he referred to this as economism. And in fact, looking back at a number of socialist movements, the in practice approach has been, we'll talk seriously about ethics after the revolution. Any talk about ethics before the revolution is a bourgeois artifact, and we can't be bothered with that. And very often, historically, that bourgeois artifact of ethics before the revolution is seen as something that the Catholic Church has concocted. Now, insofar as on a worldwide basis we have socialism that turns out to be a kind of economism that doesn't really want to address in serious, sustained dialogue the fundamental ground of the dignity of the human person, then I think our dialogue is not altogether honest. But John, perhaps you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, I would just like to ask a question or two to our esteemed guest here. Are you at all familiar with Rerum Novarum? Hello?
Basil, we have a mic off one. I bet you want a mic on. Yes, there you are.
Let
John
me
was
answer
asking about the tradition of papal encyclicals on labor, one of the last of which would be John Paul II's Laborem Exercens, and of course he was writing as someone who was intimately familiar with what purported to be a socialist regime.
Let me try to dissect this argument for a little bit, or not argument, your philosophy. This is something that socialists have taken very seriously. We see that there is a frustration of the inability of capitalism to promise economic freedom, but there's also a frustration of the ability of socialism to promise political freedom, which is also something that humanity has called for. So what Marx was getting at, and this is why you call it the inhumanity, was there was no real form of socialism, political systems, and socialist economics before the revolution happened in 1917 and these other places. In 1848, when they tried to overthrow the governments in Europe, and in the 1860s and 1870s, and what happened was, a few days later, the police came in, bashed everybody's heads in, and many people died. So that really did have an impact on Marx. We do take the and what he really started drawing on is this ability that the feudalist revolution, that the capitalist revolution would repeat itself. The bourgeoisie kills the king, and they take over the political system, and they abolish the upper class, and they spread violently across the other places. Well, we look at things with a broader perspective today, and we see that the proletarian revolution must not create the same conditions that the bourgeoisie came to power. First of all, it's completely unethical, and second of all, his analysis forgot the basic premise of his own theory that he came up with. That is that these revolutions don't come up the same way. The revolution that produced feudalism did not come out that way. They didn't care that the slave owners still had slaves. And the bourgeoisie revolution did not care that gilded production and individual production existed. So why is it our responsibility as socialists to get out there and pass laws to completely save humanity from hierarchy and from private property and from all this other stuff? That's an unproven premise of Marx. That's something that the other people after Marx really ran with, especially Lenin and Stalin. He never actually gave evidence to support that theory of his. He cited it maybe once or twice in the Principles of Communism and later works. But it's completely unproven, and empirical evidence from the 20th century says that that's not how the socialist revolution is going to happen. So let me give you an idea of how it is going to happen.
Well, this is an answer of a question that I didn't really ask. I was asking if you were familiar with Rerum Novarum.
No, I said no.
Okay.
I think your mic was off then. Your mic was off then.
All right.
I have a question.
Because in that document, and this is a document that I would encourage anybody, whether if they're economically or politically inclined to read, as well as subsequent documents. Pope Leo the 13th, rather, he gave an argument of why socialism can't work. And it was because it said, socialism, and I'm quoting from paragraph 15, is that it is clear that the main tenet of socialism, community of goods, must be utterly rejected, since it only injures those whom it would seem meant to benefit. It is directly contrary to the natural rights of mankind, and would introduce confusion and disorder into the commonwealth. And this is speaking in terms of private property. Private property is a sacred right. It's a natural right that we all have. And to replace that with public property, where there's no responsibility except by the state, and we all know that an increased government is not the solution. Bigger government is not the solution.
Define private property.
Property that you own, privately, independently.
Again, here's where that falls apart. Production used to be individual production, so we don't have anything against individual property. If you individually produce something and you sell it, that we accept that as a form of socialism, because it's social ownership. You made it, you sold it 1-to-1. Our motto is one worker, one vote. So if you, that's the motto of the whole democracy at work movement. But things are socially produced today. There's thousands of people that produce it. What your individual ownership translates to is your ability to commodify other people and to own the product of their labor, to extract value from them.
May I jump in
Please do.
with a question? Perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, that your reference to socialism perhaps is different from what the Pope is proposing there.
I think it's the same principle.
Right. But what I heard was, well, then
No.
there is a...
It's not the same principle because
Right.
the
socially...
What year was this quote?
Well,
This was written
1891. 1891.
All right, I'll go with that one then. 1891.
Okay, so...
And there's a subsequent document written by John Paul II called Centesimus Annus, written 100 years after that, which clarifies that statement as well.
Well, there's also quotes from the Bible that talk about a needs-based economy and talk about common property. There's also the Mormon religion, the cousins of the main prophet of the Mormon religion called directly for the word socialism and supported it. And in fact, when Marx tried to produce existing examples of socialism, he would cite religious communes, and particularly one of the Mormon communes, the United Order. So
I think it's very important when we're throwing around these terms that we define them in the context in which they were used. If you look at the encyclical was directly addressing the idea of confiscation of property and removal of property from the people working it. If you look at what our guest is talking about, he's also addressing the concept of the property being removed from the people who are working it. So whereas what the Pope was trying to address was the idea of property being separated from those who owned it and worked it, that's what modern day socialists are also trying to do. They're trying to promote cooperative ownership so that the people working the land are the people who are owning the land and owning the profit from that land. Land being just one example of the means of production.
That's not what Reverend Navarre was about. Reverend Navarre was identifying an issue of this disparity between capital and labor. He was identifying the issue while still maintaining the principle that the two have to work together. They're not contrary to each other. They need to work together for a stable economy. You can't have capital without labor, and there can't be labor without capital.
John, you're not listening.
Okay, first of all, socialism is still capital production. There's still capital in socialism because if there's a monetary system in socialism. Socialism is the capitalism of the working class. It's capital that's in the control of the workers instead of having themselves be subjected to commodities as part of the system to be capital for somebody else. Now, if you're talking about communism, and this is another incorrect theory of Marx, that you're going to go from socialism to communism very quickly. We reject that idea. We're not the Communist Party of America. We're the Socialist Party of America.
I have a question, my final question. You talk about the socialism in general don't generate political freedom. At the same time, capitalism doesn't provide, or that's what's the empirical the empirical data show, doesn't provide economic freedom. Now, Paul VI always said, well, one thing is the theoretical socialism, another thing is the concrete socialist movement which exists in certain part of the world. I'm talking about the 1960s and early 1970s. And when you look at those movements, some socialist movement, they don't generally provided political freedom, but they did not provide what we may call economic freedom. And you can have the example of Cuba, Venezuela, and many others, Soviet Union itself. Now, I understand there are differences between what you are referring to socialism and those models, but what is the example, scenario, the concrete example of that socialism as you define, where it exists, at one point you said absolute freedom? Is there any example?
Absolute freedom would
example?
not.
Yeah.
Absolute freedom would not exist under under a transition from capitalism to socialism. Surely, absolute freedom would be in a needs-based economy where there is no monetary policy, and you do what's according to your abilities, to other people according to their needs, and they do the same. Labor exchanges itself voluntarily through association. However, we cannot go from the system that we're at to any kind of system that has any of those principles. The next step is to change the structure of capital production to produce capital for the workers themselves. Now, let me answer your question. You guys will have to give me a couple minutes here. Here's what we define as the problem with that socialism that you spoke about. They had to take power at a time when there was no socialism in the economy and there was no socialism in the political system. What the democracy at work movement is trying to produce is a base of socialism that people can identify that already exists within the capitalist system. So that when the workers come out for socialism, they might not even know what the word means, by the way. When the bourgeoisie came out for capitalism, they had no idea they would produce capitalism. They had no idea what capitalism was. When the people banded together in the countryside and made feudalism, they had no idea what feudalism was. So what's going to happen is this. Eventually, when labor starts organizing for cooperatives, the system is going to, somebody, a Democrat or Republican, is going to think of the idea to give cooperatives, to invest in cooperatives. And you're going to have this base of working class organizations existing already in the economy. So when they want to take power, for example, what's going to end up happening is the system is going to try to take those things away from them. And that is when they're going to come out and try to expand those sectors of the economy that already exist and are helping them. When the bourgeoisie took control, it's because they already had local government, they already had a parliament, they already had private production. So they looked at things and went, these things are helping us. Why not expand those things? So that's what we're trying to produce. We're not trying to seize anything. We're trying to produce that base that already exists, and then later on, workers are going to start identifying and then go, hey, these things already exist and they're helping me. Why not expand those throughout the entire economy? That's how every other revolution in history has happened. Whereas the socialism in the 20th century didn't do that. They broke the rules and they tried to build socialism from the top down that didn't exist already. It's not supposed to happen from a political party organization. It's supposed to happen from the people themselves looking at something that already exists in the economy and thinking, hey, why not expand that? Why not make that bigger? That's suiting my interest more than that other form of property over there. So that's what we mean in the democracy at work movement and how we're going to mobilize and actually accomplish our goals in the future.
Unfortunately, we've got 3 minutes left. This happens to us just about every week. I just want to say I much appreciate the insights and the projections that our guest has given us. I especially appreciate his stressing the role of third parties, and I look forward to hearing more from him. Now, you might not think that this is altogether reliable testimony that I'm giving, but would you believe that Christy Yao has said that at the end of the program, she'd like to see some sort of metaphysical resolution of the discussion? Well, at any rate, let me offer this as the metaphysical thought for the day. There is an axiom in the philosophy of St. Thomas, and the English version of it is, everything realizes itself in action. And certainly we would want to count the human person as covered by this everything. And I think what distributists and socialists of the best sort and market capitalists of the best sort want to emphasize is that we need to have the freedom to act in order to realize most fully our potential. And I think what we'd also want to say in the American Solidarity Party, and Thomas would say this as well, is it's good for us to be free because we're God's creatures. Love is diffusive of itself. Love has given rise to creation. As creatures in creation, We want to maximize our freedom, and that's how we perfect ourselves. So I think that might be a metaphysical point of an agreement. That leaves me with a minute, and in this last minute, I want to read today's gospel selection for today's liturgy from the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus said to the crowds, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land, and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. Of its own accord the land yields fruit, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest is come." He said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, that when it is grown in the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Without parables he did not speak to them, but to his own disciples he explained everything in private. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks to all. We'll be in touch during the course of the week. The wrap-up is done nicely by our producer, Sebastian Mahfoud. I appreciate everyone's input. Very, very many thanks to all of you. And it was especially nice to have our visitor, and especially nice to hear Matthew Bartko. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.